Before we start this evening, there's something that I probably should have had announced, but Chris Ross's father, most of you know he has cancer, has had it for a while. He's been on chemo, and it was determined that the chemo really wasn't doing any more than just making him uncomfortable, and so they decided that they would discontinue that. And so, of course, in these cases, they usually tell you if you decide to get chemo, you might last a year to 2 years, but usually when you don't, it's about 6 months. So Chris called me and talked to me this afternoon, and it was kind of expected, and I know he'd appreciate getting a text from you or just a way to sort of connect with him. He really does appreciate it. He lives over on the coast. Yeah, he's been over here a couple times. I think he worships at Los Osos. Yeah. Sometimes you kind of wonder why it is, we study, books like this, and there are parts of it that I don't think really demand a whole lot of attention. They're there, I think, for interest. When you're trying to figure out, maybe the census that's taken, you get an idea of the size of the tribes, and then of course when it comes to the battles that they fought, the kings that they defeated. So I suspect I've thought of, well, what was, other than it's God's word and God wanted it written down, what use would it be for the people? Can you think of anything just right offhand? I mean, there are certain things that we learn, principles of God that we learn about, and there's certainly a pattern. You see that all through the scriptures. So what have we learned, or what have you learned? And I guarantee you that there's no particularly correct answer. I'm just asking you to sort of give me what you've been able to absorb. Sure, and we get pictures of both of that. We get the severity, and then there are times when God is forgiving. And I don't always understand why He's severe as much as He is, or when He forgives what He gives. But He's God, and God is the one who decides that, and that makes me feel good knowing that I don't have to know it. I don't have to understand it completely. I just trust in God. When you think of the verse in the New Testament that tells us why we ought to understand the Old Testament. Do you have one that comes in mind? How about 1 Corinthians? Does that get it any closer? Let's turn over to 1 Corinthians 10. And strange as it certainly wouldn't seem, is that Paul is trying to encourage the Corinthians to be faithful. And since you think a lot about learning that from the Old Testament, that you wouldn't be shocked if that's what he says. There's certain things that we learn in the Old Testament. And so in chapter 10 it says, "We do not want you to be unaware, brothers and sisters, that our fathers were all under the cloud." And of course, that would be talking about what period of time? Okay, when they were in the wilderness. Okay? And they all passed through the sea. You know about that, when the waters parted. And they all were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea. And they all ate the same spiritual food, and they all ate the same spiritual food, and they all drank the same spiritual drink, for they were drinking from the spiritual rock, which followed them, and the rock was Christ. Nevertheless, with most of them, God was not pleased, for their dead bodies were spread out in the wilderness. So that would be talking about what generation? Prior to Joshua, when they were in the wilderness, and there was a certain amount of rebellion that was there, and then that God said that you're not going to make it into the promised land. And of course, Moses didn't either, nor did Aaron. It goes on to just give all these sort of general examples, and that's something that I learned. And so I've always been a great believer in let's not make the Bible too complicated so we'll sound smart because we're talking about it. The principles are pretty simple. And they're simple enough for all of us, I think, to understand to one degree or another. So I listed some things here that come from our study of the Old Testament, and certainly would come from our study of Joshua. We have evidence of God's faithfulness to his covenant. That's one of the things that's very powerful, in that the promise was made beginning in Abraham, and God just keeps taking care of it and making it something that's going to come fulfilled over many, many, many years. But he's faithful, and he does what he promises. I put down that I just think it probably could be a good source of records for the people of Israel to be able to say, this is what happened 100 years before, and to be able to look and see what was a part of the conquest of the land that was promised to them by Abraham. We would study the reasons why God gives a judgment of failure to the people. So we know that this is something that it's a thread that runs through, and that's why in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, I think Paul uses that as a very general principle. God expects us to be strong and to be faithful. And the basic spiritual issues. I noticed when Kevin was talking, he did what preachers often do. We ask a question, and we have an idea in our mind of what the answer is, and everybody's sitting out there, and then I felt like it, because I've always, given you one, and I'm thinking, boy, this is an easy one. But he was asking a question, and I thought, I bet he's thinking, boy, this is an easy one. And it was to him. But, when you ask a question, as I've often done, and it has a number of answers, you're sort of wondering, well, which one is it? Is it evil or is it sin? When it can probably be both, those kinds of things. So it's an interesting thing to understand that there is a principle there that we learn about what's good and what's right and what it means to be faithful and what it means to be unfaithful. And I think one of the things, when you think about why the Lord wanted to clean house, was beware of what? What's that? Idolatry. And you might learn about idolatry and be affected by it. How, Jessica?
If they didn't take seriously the consequences of the former generation,
Okay.
then they would fall into the same mistakes.
Right.
God wanted it to be clear. This is the consequences of your actions when you fall into idolatry.
Yeah.
He wanted that to be decisive and to know this is what happens when you disobey me and when you repeatedly fall into idolatry.
Sure. Or if you do something is, I think, impactful, and that is marrying someone.
Right.
And they did do that. Just about everything they were told to do, they did do it to some degree or another. So there's the things that are there, and it applied in the New Testament and also applies in the Old Testament. Now, do you remember? Go ahead.
Maybe this is too specific, but one of the big lessons for me that comes from Joshua is that when God gives an edict, he expects it to be followed to the letter. We see that with Jericho and then Achan right afterwards. That's always a lesson that sticks to me very clearly from Joshua.
Yeah, it is. That is pretty much true most of the time, but we've noticed here that there's some places here, well, why didn't God get more angry with this particular thing? But generally speaking, when you get right out of the gate, that's where we learn this is the way you do it. And this is the way to be pleasing to me. And I think we get from that what God wants us to do is to respect what he says, and through that we can be faithful, not any other way. If you remember when we were talking about the Gibeonites, which is what we read about in chapter 9, and what was the general story of the Gibeonites that made it kind of entertaining?
They put on a ruse
A ruse, huh? Wow. Nice word, Larry. Yeah. Yeah, they faked them out. They faked them out, didn't they? I mean, what's interesting, and one of the things I didn't notice about how this story develops over where these kings are going to kind of meet their end, the five kings, and they talked about the Gibeonites. Now, it turned out that it says the Gibeonites are a great city, and the population of them, it was pretty much, of the highest. And that, to me, I thought, that even makes it a rather more significant ruse. Is that here they were from this great city, but what were they able to pull off?
That they were from a long way.
Just poor wandering people, just kind of wandering through town. And they'd heard about Israel, and they'd heard about their power and their authority with everywhere. It seemed like everywhere they went with their God. And so they thought, boy, it would probably be better off if we didn't fight these guys because they defeated so many people along the way. What's going to happen to us? But they were a great city, and described that way by the kings. But they convinced them that they were people who really weren't settled in this area. They weren't the kind of people that when you come in, you want to get rid of us because we don't really belong here. And so they believed them, and they did what it was that it kind of seemed like the right thing. They seemed sincere, and so they cut them some slack. Go ahead, Todd.
Since you're back there at Gibeon,
Yeah, got it.
back there in chapter 14, after all this takes place, I was wondering, because usually whenever it says something, but they did not seek the Lord's counsel, something negative happens.
Yeah.
And I haven't found it so far up to, but we're in up to chapter 13. I was wondering, where does that, because it says, then the men of Israel took some of their provisions, but did not seek the Lord's counsel.
Yeah, that's verse 14 of chapter 9, is it? Okay.
So Joshua established peace with them, and so forth. And then they started, get into 10, 11 stuff. They have all these battles.
Right.
So I'm wondering,
The answer is, I can't read where anything bad happened as a result of that.
I don't either.
Yeah, well, then, we agree on that. I mean, it is noted that they didn't seek the guidance of the Lord. And then also, when they get to the point where the people find out what they've actually done, and Joshua seems to be understanding and forgiving, and gave them permission to stick around with them. But it says, he did that so the people, I'm assuming, who knew that probably we shouldn't be with these people, these are the ones that we're not going to destroy at this time. Go ahead.
They eventually, it's part of their downfall with the idolatry and
Uh-huh.
with
Right, yeah. Well, they
back to bite them then in some way.
sure, and it does. I mean, there is a certain punishment, but not the kind of way we think. But okay, they did wrong. Okay, they're going to get punished. That's kind of the sin of Achan look. Or we expected them to follow, as Robert was saying, what God told them, what God instructed them to do when it came to Jericho. But there are these situations which arise, and you kind of wonder, well, why was God okay with that? And I'm okay if he was okay with it. But it's like, Todd, you're thinking, well, at some point, these guys shouldn't be getting away with this. And just one more second, Robert. Go ahead now, Todd. What do you think about this now? Is there any reason why? I mean, as you were looking for it, why were you looking for it?
Well, I just thought it was interesting because most of the time, like I say, when you see that phrase, but they did not, or they did not
Sure.
seek God's counsel, something negative happens. But there is no place after that I could find that something negative, a punishment or whatever.
Right.
Or whatever happened.
Yeah, it certainly.
It's just there.
Yeah, and it may be in some sort of indirect form, you know, and something else may have happened, just wasn't written down. You know, there's always that possibility. But, you know, when we're looking at it, it's generally, we see them do something. It may take a while. In the case of Achan, took a little while before people found out about that, but eventually they were punished. Yes, Jessica?
I guess in a way, so when they first come up, they discovered that they'd been lied to and given next to their neighbors, technically. The people grumbled because they were not attacking them. And the thing
Sure.
that they lost is the fact that that was a part of the land, that's part of the inheritance that was taken away from them now. They could not attack it, they could not
Right.
possess it. So that was the thing. Plus they also couldn't.
So you're saying that might have been some sort of indirect punishment?
Yeah, they didn't get that land, they didn't get the spoils, people were forced to live amongst them, even though it's a work labor, that was still a lot of land
Right.
that they weren't gonna get.
Right. Okay. Yeah, Robert?
Pretty much everything I want to say in the sentence.
Okay. I'm glad we did it well. All right, so in chapter 10, the other kings who had planned on getting with it and fighting Israel, they find out about what the Gibeonites did. And they're not happy about it, as you might imagine. In chapter 10 and verse 1, Vance, could you read that down through verse 2? Chapter 10, 1 and 2.
Now it came about when Adonizedek, king of Jerusalem, heard that Joshua had captured Ai and had utterly destroyed it, just as he had done to Jericho and its king. So he had done to Ai and its king. And that the inhabitants of Gibeon had made peace with Israel, then and were within their land, that he feared greatly, because Gibeon was a great city, like one of the royal cities, because it was greater than Ai, and all its men were mighty.
Okay, so it says down, skip on now, read verse, just read 4 and 5 too.
Let me read 3 too. So it says, Therefore Adonizedek, king of Jerusalem, sent word to Hoam, king of Hebron, and to Piram, king of Jarmuth, and to Jaipha, king of Lachish, and to Debir, king of Eglon, saying, Come up to me and help me, and let us attack Gibeon, for it has made peace with Joshua and with the sons of Israel. So the 5 kings of the Amorites, the king of Jerusalem, the king of Hebron, the king of Jarmuth, the king of Lachish, the king of Eglon, gathered together and went up, and with all their armies encamped by Gibeon and fought against them.
Okay. I want you to say the 5 names of the king backwards. Yeah, so these are the guys, and they're a rather significant, group of kings. But then what's interesting about it, you're thinking, aha, now they're going to get it. But now, verse 6. The men of Gibeon sent word to Joshua at the camp at Gilgal, saying, Do not abandon your servants. Come up to us quickly and save us and help us. For all the kings of the Amorites that live in the hill country have assembled against us. So how does Joshua react? He doesn't go, well, you guys are finally getting what you deserve. Or now you're going to cause us to get what we deserve, for accepting you. Joshua went up from Gilgal, and he and all the people of war with him, and all the valiant warriors. And the Lord said to Joshua, Do not fear for them, for I have handed them over to you. Not one of them will stand against you. So Joshua came upon them suddenly by marching all night from Gilgal, and the Lord brought them into confusion before Israel. Imagine this, they marched all night, and then they had to fight. That's a little overwhelming to me. But obviously the God of heaven is working with them and making sure. He says, you're not going to lose. You are going to defeat them. So that was, when God says that, kind of going to this consistency that Robert was talking about as far as disobedience, that when God promises you're going to take these people, even though it looks like, I'm not sure why they would be, well, I don't know. Why do you think they might have some doubt, the people of Israel, in dealing with these kings?
It's literally 5-on-1.
Well, yeah, so it sounds pretty much like these are significant kings, and it would be natural. It's not like they hadn't been fearful before when they got into a situation where they're going to have to deal with some very powerful individuals. But anyway, God says, don't worry about it. You're going to be taken care of, and you're going to win. Now, skip on over and let's get to a passage and an event that it's just so fun to read. I mean, there's many different questions or answers provided to questions, and if you have any sense of understanding on this whole thing about the day the earth stood still. That's not it. That was the movie, I think, wasn't it? Yeah. It's the day the sun stood still. And so Joshua spoke to the Lord on the day when the Lord turned the Amorites over to the sons of Israel, and he said, in the sight of Israel. Remember, Amorites was tended to be a rather generic term when describing the people in that area. So he wasn't talking about a separate group of Amorites, although it can be used in that way. So it says, when the Lord turned the Amorites over to the sons of Israel, he said in the sight of Israel. Now, who's doing the talking here? Joshua. And this is what's somewhat fascinating to me, because what he says is, sun stand still at Gibeon and moon at the valley of Ajalon. So the sun stood still and the moon stopped until the nation avenged themselves of their enemies. So is there something about that sounds a little bit odd or strange to you? I mean, other than the sun standing still. Yeah, well, that's right. Yeah, well, let's not go down. We're not, as far as astronomy is concerned, we're not going to completely figure this one out, all right? But there are a lot of different theories about it that relate to some of the superstitions that people had in that day. All right, so assuming, the universe works the way it works, then what shouldn't happen? Yeah, it shouldn't stop. But again, who is the one who said, sun, stand still? Joshua. It wasn't. You'd think that'd be kind of a job for God, wouldn't you? But anyway, that's what he says, and then that's what happens. Now, so what kind of conclusion have some of you come to on this one? I mean, go ahead. Is that you? Got it. Go ahead, Vance.
There's a high degree of faith that Joshua has in God's presence with him.
Yeah.
When Elijah calls out to God on Mount Carmel for fire, right? It's sort of like the man initiates the miracle, like you said.
Right.
It takes a degree of courage. It's kind of a gutsy thing, because as the leader of Israel,
Sure.
to say that before the people, and then the sun doesn't stand still, it's kind of an awkward moment.
Yeah, it'd be kind of embarrassing. Yeah.
It shows there's a high degree of faith that Joshua has that the Lord is with him.
Yeah. So you look at it. That's good. Somebody have their hand up? Yes. Go ahead. I kind of doubt that. I'm sure you would have said it just well, Autumn.
Read the names of the kings.
Yeah, go ahead. Who's over here?
The other thing is that right before Joshua asked him to do this, it says, the Lord threw down large stones from heaven on them as far as Azekah, and they died. There were more who died because of the hailstones.
Okay, so some have said this is maybe sort of a meteor shower of some kind. Okay, but anyway, whatever it is, it's coming down from the heavens in a rather unusual way. I think that's the way it's described. So that's another aspect of it. Okay, so but what's your conclusion? Anybody have any conclusions? Oh, sorry.
Like it says, I think it gave them enough time to do what they wanted to do.
Yeah.
It says, until the people had avenged themselves.
Okay, so it did. So I wouldn't argue with that. So it still doesn't tell me, well, why did it stand still, other than that's the end part. No, go ahead. I'm sorry. The cough went the same time you said something.
God was with him.
Okay, God was with him. All right. So what does that tell us?
It tells us that if we put our faith in God, no matter what, that all things are possible. Not to get too much into Philippians, but the idea is Joshua asked for something that should be quite literally impossible to achieve their victory
Okay.
It reminds me somewhat of in Hebrews chapter 11 where it is revealed to us that Abraham knew that if Isaac were to be sacrificed in his heart, he knew God would resurrect him.
God will make it, he'll make it to work somehow. So-
Exactly. So there's this, to build on what Vance said, to me, there's this predetermination that because I believe and have faith in God, I can ask for what seemingly is impossible, and I have faith that God has the power to accomplish this.
Okay. So what else? Yes, go ahead, Mark.
I think, we can speculate and think about how this happened.
Yeah.
I think the bottom line is that, like we've been saying, God made it happen.
Right.
It had to be some kind of a miracle
Yeah, some divine intervention at the very least, yeah.
that made this happen to so many people.
Yeah.
It's pretty simple.
Okay, yeah, and I think that's where I kind of leave it. I just say, well, it happened. It's not something that would happen naturally, and so God must have made it happen.
There's a lot of unexplained and interesting
Right.
facts in the Bible about it with no explanation.
Yeah. So we just have to kind of accept it and do it. And I think that's in the end. But people trying to figure it out from an earthly standpoint, it gets very interesting in some of the writings that they have. And then again, as it relates to folk knowledge and things like that. I mean, it's very interesting in that regard. Go ahead, Dana.
I think verse 14 is really significant because it says that there's never been a day like that before and there hasn't been a day after it. That hasn't never
Yeah.
happened.
So it was obviously a unique.
It was a one-time
Right.
thing.
Yeah.
It mentions that the Lord heeded the voice of a man.
Right. Yeah, which was also.
That ever happened,
Yeah.
but
Sure, but you would tend to think that God would say, I am going to do this, and you need to believe that it's going to happen. Okay, somebody have a hand down here? Go ahead. Well, there's a lot of that going on, isn't there? Yeah. Yeah, well, right, yeah. Yeah, and I think as far as explaining it, it's just like trying to explain the resurrection. Well, from a human standpoint, there's not a logical explanation. It's that God pronounced it was happen, and it did happen. Okay, we got to move along here.
Would it be fair to say Deuteronomy 29:29?
Well, it might. Well, go ahead and read it, Richard, just for fun.
The secret thing is the law.
Yeah, that's right. Well, go ahead. Somebody turn who can see better than Richard. And I know that's why he's not reading it.
The secret things belong to the Lord our God, but those things which are
Okay, yeah, so
to our children forever.
yeah, I would say it's certainly it's something we can't really understand. Go ahead, Autumn. It's a good point, Richard. Go ahead, Autumn.
Everyone probably already knows this too, but there's that smart historian people have proven, like through their accounting, that actually did happen too.
Yeah,
Like that, there's a day that is, or there's time missing in
sure.
their accounting.
Yeah. So, again, we may be able to fill in some of the gaps in terms of our understanding, but again, we end up, what? Believing that God is the one who did it. So, all right, now, let's go ahead and look at the event with how the kings were defeated. And that's at, this whole thing about it's not written in the book of Jasher. That's a book that shows up. It's a mysterious book. Nobody knows what it is. Nobody knows the source of it. If you read, for instance, the other time it's mentioned over there in 2 Samuel, you get the sense that this might have been a book of poems or songs or something like that. But it's not what you would call an inspired writing that ended up in the Bible. But there are a lot of these books that were around. Psalms would be another one that was a book of songs or psalms. And this one, at least the way it's opined, it's that this is maybe a book of poetry that spoke to some of the great events that happened in the history of Israel. So you might want to look that up and see if you can get anything interesting out of that. I think you'd find it interesting. In chapter 10, verse 16, it says, "Now these 5 kings had fled and hidden themselves in the cave at Makkedah." So it didn't turn out so well for them. I mean, getting 5 together, it's like thinking, well, what if we had only gotten 10 together? Maybe that would have worked. But the 5 kings have been found hidden in the cave at Makkedah. Joshua said, well, roll large stones against the mouth of the cave and post the men by it to guard them. That's one of those things like my mind starts working and I sort of imagine it, and I'm sort of imagining these guys thinking they are hiding in the cave and they're in pretty good shape, you know, nobody's going to find us in here. And the next thing they're hearing, boom, 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 and the rocks are being pushed up against the opening to the cave, and then they're trapped. So it says, roll the large stones against the mouth of the cave and post men by it to guard them. But do not stay there yourselves. Pursue your enemies and attack them from behind. So just get rid of the guys, get them out of the way, get the kings out of the way. Then you go about fighting. And so it came about, verse 20, when Joshua, the son of Israel, had finished striking them down in a very great defeat until they were destroyed, and the survivors of them who escaped had entered the fortified cities, that all the people returned to the camp to Joshua at Makkedah in peace, and no one uttered a word against any of the sons of Israel. That's one of those interesting phrases. What do you think of? I mean, what's your perception when that idea is put forth? Yeah, I mean, yeah. Don't mess with these guys. Yeah. So I think that's probably it. Does anybody have any other ideas about it? Okay. So let's. So Joshua says, "Open the mouth of the cave and bring these 5 kings out to me from the cave." And at this point, they may have wished that they ended up staying in the cave, you know, because it said they did so, and they brought them out from the cave. The king of Jerusalem. Remember, this was the name of Jerusalem before it became the significant Jerusalem, more in the time of David and Solomon, and then ultimately around the time of Jesus. The king of Hilburn, the king of Jarmuth. Where's Vance? I thought I'd maybe have him do these again. The king of Lachish and the king of Eglon. When they brought these kings out to Joshua, Joshua called for all the men of Israel and said to the leaders of the men of war who had gone with him, "Come forward." Now here's where it gets, you know, I don't know if you want to call it cruel, but it's certainly symbolically showing something here. So come forward and put your feet on the necks of these kings. So what is that? What is that used for historically? It's not just significant to the Bible, but what about putting your foot on the neck of someone? It demonstrated power over them, is what it did. Yeah, so that traditionally that's what they would do. It was like really kind of rubbing their faces in it, be a way of looking at it, because it would show the power that was over them. So they came forward and put their feet on their necks, and Joshua said to them, "Do not fear or be dismayed. Be strong and courageous, for the Lord will do this to your enemies with whom you fight." So why would he have to kind of make them not be afraid to do it? That's what it sounds like it says. Yeah, go ahead, Jessica.
There's still more battles to come. It's gonna get worse before it gets better. There's even greater battles for them to still accomplish.
Okay, so explain that to me just a little bit better now. Tell me, okay, they go up, you and I, we're one of the people, and we go up and we put our foot on the top of these guys, okay? And that, obviously, we look pretty much in control, right? Okay, so why would they not say, "Wow, we've got them"?
Because to them, they may, in a moment of hesitation, may think, well, this is just one battle. We might lose the next one. So the fear, as humans, the fear is still there.
Uh-huh.
Because we look on the physical terms, like
Yeah.
So we may have won this one, but what about the next one?
Okay. That's a reasonable, I think, interpretation of it. It says it came about sunset that Joshua gave the command, this is verse 27, and they took them down from the trees and threw them into the caves where they had hidden themselves and put large stones over the mouth of the cave to this very day. So that's where they ended up. Well, yeah, but go ahead now and read. We'll read 28. Joshua captured Makkedah on that day and struck it, and its king with the edge of the sword. He utterly destroyed it, and every person who was in it he left no survivors. So he did to the king of Makkedah just as he had done to the king of Jericho. So there they are. They're stuck, and they're going to die there. And the Lord also handed it over to Israel. It says, with its king, and he struck it, and every person who was in it with the edge of the sword. He left no survivors in it, so he did it to its king, just as he had done to the king of Jericho. So this is where it starts getting a little bit bothersome to us, because, when we start trying to work out, the details of this, well, why this and why not that? Why did it, at this point, why did they go ahead and do it like God wanted it done? What were they supposed to do? They were supposed to take care of everybody. I mean, they were to make sure they were not alive anymore. It didn't turn out that way in certain respects. If you go through and read Joshua, you find out that there were certain people that were still living. But it gets pretty gory, I guess, is what I'm saying. And so it says, and Joshua and all Israel passed on from Libnah to Lachish, and they camped by it, and they fought against it. One more town, one more king. And the Lord handed Lachish over to Israel, and he captured it on the second day and struck it, and every person who was in it with the edge of the sword, according to all that had been done to Libnah. Now, again, we have to understand the reason for the land and the reason for their nationhood. And as far as things that happen, we can't get so caught up in wondering, well, why this and why not as powerfully intimidating over some people, but yet clearly on some they just wiped them all out. And it's a little bit like the sun standing still. And that is, I don't really understand that other than that this is what God wanted. And so it's the same thing in understanding why God wanted things to be done the way they were done. Now, we know that the reason for the nation of Israel was what? According to we first learn in Abraham. In his life. Go ahead.
3 promises.
Okay, so just quickly give them to me.
You have the land promise, you have the seed promise, and you have the nation.
Okay, so that's where it all starts, and the purpose of that was so ultimately the whole world would be blessed, right?
Yes.
Okay, right. So that's where we're headed with this. And so we have to understand that that's the most important thing. And even to God, it's the most important thing. Because we have a view of God that says, okay, God, I'm feeling kind of uncomfortable, and Judy's real sick, and I'm really concerned about it. And so it just doesn't seem right for me for her to be suffering. So God, why don't you do something about it? That's the kind of stuff that we get concerned with. And, what God's thinking, of course I wouldn't know, but the point is, he'd be more concerned that, well, is Judy prepared to be with me eternally? And that's at least my way of trying to understand this. To realize that this great plan is what was most important, so that when Jesus did die, then what happened? He's resurrected, he comes back, and he's there with the apostles, and where does he send them? Out to make sure that we get to keep the land? Yeah, go ahead, Mitch.
Yeah, the way I look at it, it's more like it's a means to an end.
Yeah.
It's not an end to itself, right?
Right, yeah.
So it's just God's plan of bringing about the ultimate direction of revealing himself through Christ to provide salvation.
Right.
Why he did it that way, we don't know, right? But it's really a means to an end, so that this is all temporary.
Yeah, we understand how it ends.
Yeah.
That's important. Yeah, quick command.
It was said earlier, but I think too, we can't discount the fact that God knew what would happen when people were left and how that would drive the future of the nation into idolatry.
Right.
And how it was for their, to not sound too overbearing, it was for their spiritual protection in many ways. So I see it
Right.
a little bit differently as God knew what was going to happen when remnants were left because he knew the fallibility and the vulnerability of the heart of man.
Right, okay.
And that idolatry was immediate.
So he's kind of saving them from themselves, I guess, is a way of looking at it. So,
And the second point, I'll say this very quick.
please.
Is that the Israelite or the Canaanites, God isn't going to do something that is unjust. They have lived their lives, they've made their
Right.
decisions, they have their sins, as we know from Romans 3:23, all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God.
Right.
And as far as the quote-unquote innocence, well, we know that God will judge, those that do
Sure.
not have the ability to know good and evil.
So we have to trust in God
Exactly.
in the end. Okay. All right, so in chapter 11, it says, that we're getting into this summarizing what? The conquest of these places. So the southern part and the northern part are taken in the end of chapter 10 and chapter 11. All right, so let's just read now verse 21 through, this is chapter 11, because I like the way that it's summarized, and it shows how ultimately the power of the people through God was supreme, and as long as they obeyed God, everything was going to work out, even though the details don't always make us comfortable. Then Joshua came at that time, and he eliminated the Anakim from the hill country from Hebron. Do you remember when those people were mentioned? Remember when they first got ready to go into the land, and they saw Anakim, who are giant people, and they were terrified by them, but it didn't work out that way this time. They eliminated them. It says, Joshua utterly destroyed them with their cities, and there were no Anakim left in the land of the sons of Israel, only in Gaza, Gath, and Ashdod some remained. So, there were some of those people who were left. So Joshua took the whole land in accordance with everything that the Lord had spoken to Moses, and Joshua gave it as an inheritance to Israel according to their divisions by their tribes, so the land was at rest from war. So at least at that point in time, they're finished. They came in, they were going to take over the land. It's now summarized as being something that indeed that has happened. And so it's at this point that they begin dividing up the land, and we'll talk a little bit about Caleb's request next week in chapter 14, but we'll be moving through this pretty rapidly. And then I'm going to go back and look at a couple of things that were said in the book of Numbers, preparing them for going into the land, I think are kind of interesting when we try to put together things as they are and the things as we try to understand them and make sense of all of what was the promise of God. So, the 5 kings are destroyed. The Gibeonites made peace with Israel. As far as we know, that remained. And things were generally okay. You know how you find in your life that you come to points in time when what? Things are really going well. And you feel like you're really in control. And then what happens? There's always something else that comes along and more challenges. Or I made a mistake when I was doing what I thought I should be doing, and then it comes back to hurt me. So in understanding that, I think at least the picture that we get here is that there was a point in time when the taking of the land was completed. Now, they have problems because they don't kill everybody. So that creates issues for them. And that's where we'll leave it for today. So I'll send that out to you. What I'm going to have you read from Numbers. But go ahead and, well, I'll just send it out to you in a message. So, okay, I'll lead us in prayer and then we'll be finished. Father, help us to always be humbled by your word, and how meager our understanding is at times. But we thank you for your will, and we know what it was that was promised to Abraham. And that was that salvation would come to the whole world. And as we look at it, we observe what happened. It may not seem exactly right to us. We do this all the time with some of the stories. You know, why would God put Abraham through what he did in having to almost kill his son? But that was God's way, and we trust in him. So as we leave this evening, we pray that in our hearts we will find just trust in God. That's all. Because that's the only thing that really matters. And to trust in ourselves, in the end, will not solve anything for us. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen. Thank you.